So, James, what is a comic book?
Uh,
Describe it as say to somebody. I mean, I know what a comic book is generally. I've read some comic books, but I'm not really a comic book person. Not to say I dislike them, I just don't read them a bunch. But say if you were explaining to somebody who's never heard of a comic book, what's a comic book?
a comic book is technically it's a magazine. So basically, it's a magazine full of comics, so like the comic strips and a newspaper. And there's a bunch of different genres. There's like comedy and horror. Basically, as far as movies and TV shows, it's a
Basically,
magazine. It comes out like every month at like and it's like a graphic novel, but a magazine. But technically, comics were there first. So actually, a graphic novel is a comic,
so
but a novel.
basically, you're saying a comic book is a compilation of like newspaper comics and stuff,
No,
or like
it's
other.
like it's sort of like an extended newspaper comic, like
Okay.
from they usually have I forget how many pages, but like they always have like a certain amount of pages.
Number. Okay.
Mm.
So, and now, I would like you to explain. Don't go full berserker rage, but explain what is the difference between a comic book and a graphic novel.
Okay, the difference between a comic book and a graphic novel: a comic book is a magazine. You get it about once a month usually. Some of the really popular ones come out once a week if production rate is high enough, and some of them only come out like once a year or every few months. Graphic novel, it's a novel. It's like it's sort of like a really long comic book that's a novel. It could be like the only one. It's not guaranteed to have like another one.
Okay. So,
And there are also collections of comic books that some people think are graphic novels, but they're actually just like a bunch of the comic books collected in one book.
okay. So, I think I know my definition of the difference, but to reiterate, basically, a graphic novel is a book turned in, like a novel turned into comic form.
Pretty much.
So, then, I'd like to ask, what do you think are the differences between a book, comic book, graphic novel, and movie?
Well, a book is just words. Like, it's just words just typed out on paper. You read it. And with books, I guess it can be kind of interesting to read about epic fight scenes and stuff. But since you can't actually see any of the stuff, you're kind of like, oh, that sounds cool. I couldn't really see it, but in my imagination, that looks cool. But you can get like even more entertainment about just reading the story, the backstory, the characters, like what the characters' interactions with each other, what's happening, and just the descriptions of stuff. You know?
Yeah.
But with movies, it's enjoyable to see that stuff that I was talking about. But you can also see the epic fights and big army battles and
The action.
Yeah. And you can be like, whoa, that was really cool. And get like a lot of enjoyment just out of seeing the characters doing epic stuff. And comic books and graphic novels kind of bridge the gap between those two. You can see the characters doing their epic action stuff while also reading about their interactions and the story and stuff.
Yeah, and their thoughts and stuff. Because that's
Exactly.
that's
Like the
one
perfect-
thing for me about movies is I feel like books are sort of an art where you have to like describe the atmosphere, describe the area, describe the fight scenes, describe the people, describe their thoughts. Whereas, like, I feel like, I guess what makes a book is the detail, the description, the, like, the world building, I guess. Like,
Yes.
the describing the atmosphere and stuff. Whereas what makes a movie is the action that you can show.
Right.
Would you agree?
Yes. Yes, that is true.
Okay. The history of comic books?
History of comic book.
I don't know.
Alright. Sure.
Alright.
So comic books really started around, I think, like the 30s.
So, movies are generally older than comic books.
I think that would be true. Yes.
I always kind of, I guess, figured that it would be the other way around.
Well,
Although,
sort of. Movies like we think of them now weren't really a thing. Because,
yeah.
like, you would go to the theater for, like, I think, like a quarter, maybe a nickel. And you would get to
Well,
watch,
also
like,
inflation. But,
yeah. And you would get to watch, like, a compilation of things. You would get to watch, like, maybe, like, a Western, some news stories, Three Stooges, cartoons. You wouldn't really get, like, one movie specifically. You would go into the theater and you would watch just, like, a bunch of things.
I feel like movies, in, like, a long time ago, were more similar to, recorded plays.
Sorta.
Although that's just me.
Mm.
Um,
I know that what I described is sort of how it would work. I remember my grandpa telling me about doing that.
yeah.
We just do that back in Montana.
Yep.
He's,
Back in the good old days. Oh wait, actually more like the bad old days.
Yeah.
So, I guess generally, comic books... Do you think there was any,
What? Anyone?
any, like, connection in the time that, like, comics were developed to in the time that movies started to become more what you see now? Like, when did
But
comic books generally start coming in color?
I think a lot of them were actually kind of colored. Some of them were actually colored from the start. It's because, like, there was color back then. There wasn't color film, but there was color print. So
That's
like,
true.
a lot of comic books were already colored just from the get-go.
Yeah, okay. But, like, newspaper comics, even these days, I don't think are normally colored.
The Sunday comics are colored. The regular weekly comics are not.
Ah. Okay.
Except for Garfield. Garfield is special. And Peanut. Some of the more bigger popular ones, Peanuts and Garfield and such, get colored.
Yeah. Because when you have the budget,
Yeah,
you can
exactly.
say, I want color.
Exactly.
I feel like I'm learning more than probably most of the audience here.
Possibly. I think what really kicked off, like, comic books, like, was superheroes.
So talk about superheroes. Like,
Well, the first actual superhero was Superman. Superman, basically everybody knows that Superman was the first comic superhero. But in reality, he was the first superhero ever. Comic book superheroes are the first wave of superheroes. And Superman is the first one of those. Superman was the first ever superhero.
So even though you're always getting on Marvel's side versus DC, DC was technically first.
DC was first. So technically back then they were AC, Action Comics.
Okay.
And yeah, DC started the superhero revolution in the 30s.
And
which
then
kicked off comics popularity.
Yeah. So I feel like for a while superheroes were kind of a thing confined to comics because they didn't have like the visual effects and stuff to make movies.
Yep.
And it was not as entertaining to read a novel about a superhero.
Yeah, pretty much. Comics were always superheroes' domain. I think one of the first superhero movies was the first ever Superman movie, probably, because Superman always has to be the front runner.
Of course.
Superman has to kick everything off.
And when was that?
I don't actually remember when the first Superman movie came out.
Do you know the decade?
Yes. Yeah, I believe it came out in the 70s.
70s, okay.
Kind of towards the end of the 70s.
So there was like 50 years where comic books were like where you get your superhero stories.
Yes.
Superheroes were comic book stars.
Yes. They were the thing that basically gave comics their popularity.
Okay.
But what really started to revolutionize comics, revolutionize superheroes, was actually World War II.
Really?
The 40s.
How so?
Yes. Because then everybody was panicking. It was a horrible time. Everybody was scared, depressed. It wasn't a happy time.
Not at all.
But comics gave people a thing to relax with.
An outlet.
People could read about Superman flying over to Germany and punching Hitler in the face.
Wait, was that a real thing?
Yes. Superman totally beat them up. Yeah. And people could read about Batman throwing batarangs at Nazis, and that's what sort of also created Marvel.
So that was a thing, like making comic books against your enemies.
Yes. And it invented Marvel because it created Captain America to go out there to
fight for America.
Yeah, by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby.
Okay.
And Captain America was actually the first comic that Stan Lee ever did. Captain America, issue number 2, was scripted by Stan Lee. Cool little fact there. Yeah.
So, then once the war ended, what happened? Where did comics go from there?
Down. They sort of fell apart. That was when Captain America sort of vanished. That was when I forget his name, but some jerk wrote a novel about how comics are corrupting the youth. Because for some reason, adults hate whatever the kids like. And that is when comics...
Also, a lot of adults dislike new things.
Yeah. And that is when comics were on their biggest decline. That is when the Comics Code of Authority was created. And that is what...
Comics Code of Authority?
Yes, it was this thing that all comic books had to go through, basically, sort of like...
A regulation?
Yeah. Make sure that they're family-friendly, that they were appropriate.
Aha. Like, don't have your kids playing Kirby's Epic Dreamland. Or whatever it was, that one game where he stabs an eyeball and blood comes out everywhere.
Yes.
That was supposedly meant for small children.
And that temporarily destroyed all of horror comic.
Okay.
But anyway,
So,
yeah,
like,
and
were there, could you make a comic and say, no, hey, this comic is for adults, and not have to go through the regulation? Or was it just for every comic?
it was for every comic. Some brands didn't go through the Comics Code of Authority, but if you didn't go through the Comics Code of Authority, a lot of comic vendors didn't want to put your stuff up, and people wouldn't want to buy it because it didn't have the Comic Code of Authority stamp on it.
Is that still a thing today?
No, it was abolished in the 80s.
Okay. After
and
they, I presume, realized, hey, this is pretty stupid?
Yeah, it also kind of killed superheroes. Captain America had to go away. Superman, Batman, they all just sort of
Vanished?
Yeah. But that and romance novels and just sort of slapstick comedy novels,
Generally evolving.
That was what was comics. That is what Stan Lee was forced to write.
Really?
Yes.
Forced to write?
Yes. It is what Stan Lee's boss, the former owner of Marvel, forced him to make. But then Stan Lee revolutionized comics once more.
And what did he do?
Basically, he was going to quit. He was going to quit comics because he didn't like the stuff that he was being made to make.
Okay.
So, but before he was going to do that, he talked to his wife about it, and she said, make one more comic the way that you want to make it. And he did. And that comic was Fantastic Four #1.
Okay. And what happened?
And it exploded. It was the most popular comic.
Of the
Everybody,
time?
Yeah, of the time. Everybody wanted Fantastic Four. It was super popular. And before you knew it, Stan Lee was making Fantastic Four #2.
So, when was this? Like, was this around the time that they abolished the comic thing?
No, this was the 60s. Comics Code
60s.
Authority was still a thing for the next 20 years.
Okay.
And
so what did he do if supposedly these weren't the things he was supposed to be making?
well, after its immense popularity, his boss was like, you know what? Those are popular, they're making money. Keep making superhero comics.
Even though, so those comics were the comics he made technically not stamped for approval?
They were still stamped for approval because he still didn't include gore or made the violence, just punches and stuff. And
okay.
The villains didn't die and stuff.
Okay.
And that is what kicked off the Marvel Age of Comics.
So was Stan Lee was not the original owner of Marvel, you said. His boss was.
Yes.
Okay.
As the superhero comics rose to popularity, he gradually rose to the ranks before becoming editor-in-chief, and then just completely bought Marvel.
Okay.
Yeah, and after the Fantastic Four, he created the Iron Man, the Hulk, Spider-Man, Ant-Man, the Wasp. Eventually, he decided to make a new team, which is the Avengers, which is his most popular comic ever still, was Avengers #1. Still his most popular thing.
That's impressive.
Ever. Yeah.
So, where did other comics go once Stan Lee started creating superheroes again?
Well, once Stan Lee started creating superheroes again, DC was like, superheroes are back. Bring back Superman. Bring back
Jump
Batman.
back on the bandwagon, boys.
Yeah. And then, yeah. So DC started the superheroes, and they added more. And after the Avengers were out, a little while after that, they created their counter, the Justice League.
Okay.
Because while DC was technically the original, they still rip off Marvel all the time. And Marvel rips off DC. They're just the two biggest comic names, and they're always ripping each other off.
It's like Overwatch and Paladins.
Yes! It's a lot like that.
Overwatch ripped off Paladins, created their own game, and then Paladins proceeded to rip off everything Overwatch did.
Yep.
And now they rip each other off daily.
Yeah, pretty much.
So it's kind of like that with DC and Marvel?
Yep, they're always ripping each other off. They've got answers to all of each other's superheroes. DC's got Aquaman, and Marvel's got the Submariner.
The what?
Submariner. It's a Aquaman rip. Actually, this is an Aquaman ripoff from. Wait. This is an Aquaman ripoff from before the Marvel Age of Comics. He was a superhero from he was one of the 40s heroes. But then he and Captain America had to go, and the original Human Torch all had to go away. And Captain America and Namor both came back. Captain America was found by the Avengers, and Namor became a Fantastic Four villain. The original Human Torch never really had a comeback as a major Marvel character. He shows up from every once in a while, but
you can tell he never had a comeback because I have no idea who he is.
He's some sort of weird android thing.
Okay. So how long did it take since from when they started making comics like superhero comics again to when it was finally decided that we could take away the regulation, because this was a federal law, right?
No, it was like a self-censorship thing, like the big wigs of comics.
So it was basically it was like a kind of, I guess, Nintendo stamp of approval type thing, like everyone can make whatever games they want and then feed them in, and once they get the regulation, they go through, and it's like, you can buy the other games, and they're a lot cheaper, and some of them are good, but just having that Nintendo stamp of approval really seals the deal on any game you're gonna buy. It's kind of like that?
Yeah, sorta.
Okay.
But eventually, about 2 decades, sometime in the 80s, it was about the time when following the rules was not a good thing.
Not the popular thing to do?
Yeah, when it was uncool. And the rule followers, the comic code of authority people, were starting to lose popularity. It was sort of like the reverse of before. So Marvel was like, well, now we're losing popularity because of this thing. Let's take it off.
Yeah.
And bam! Unfortunately, it sort of broke Marvel.
In what way?
Because DC had already taken it off. DC ditched it, pretty early on, in the 70s. To turn towards their dark stamp, their darkness thing, their dark comic variety. Yeah. And yes, exactly. And Marvel took it up and saw what the 80s were and saw what DC was doing and decided to make their comics dark. Which
kind of screwed them over. It's like sometimes you try and copy someone and it doesn't work.
Yes. It caused Marvel to almost go bankrupt.
Really?
Yes.
How long did that last?
Up until the 90s.
Okay. You said
the 90s? It was the 80s, and then up in the 90s, Marvel finally got their act together.
And did they like go back to making their normal comics?
Well, they tried. They went back to...
or had the damage just been done and they had to like steady themselves out?
They decided to try and get the perfect mixture of lighthearted and humor that they used to have in the new Dark Wave. So that's like Punisher and Daredevil. They're really dark now. Well, the Punisher was always dark, but now Daredevil became like a darker hero. But there's still like Spider-Man being actually light and not like just Venom.
Spider-Man with his quips.
Yeah, but still they went back to their marvelous Marvel motto, created by the late great Stanley Lieber, actually. It's his real name. The Stanley thing is actually just a pen name. Yeah. Something. And the marvelous Marvel motto being, at Marvel Comics, there will always be something for everyone. That wasn't always true, but gradually, as time went on, they would branch out into every possible
just
area
because it's such a massive company that they could afford to do that?
Yes. And by the 90s, they'd basically done that. But after their massive crash in the 80s, they weren't popular.
They weren't popular enough to fulfill the promise?
Yes, people weren't picking up Marvel Comics because of their quality crash. So, they needed to throw something out there that would catch people's eyes.
And what was that?
Civil War. The original Civil War comic series. Because the best way to catch people's eyes is having Captain America fighting Iron Man on the cover of
on the cover of a movie, even.
Yeah, well, that movie was a thing. It didn't really live up to one of my favorite comic series, though. But that is when they started churning out massive, crazy events.
It's like... yeah.
Shortly after that, in 2008, they created the Secret Invasion, which is when the Skrulls, replaced a bunch of different people and the superheroes and tried to take over the planet. It was also a great event. The Civil War brought Marvel back to come back and become the comic staple that they are today.
Was Infinity War a comic?
Infinity War was a comic. That was actually Marvel's last stand in the 80s.
Really? It came before Civil War.
Yes, as Marvel was dropping, they threw out Infinity War, and it sort of slowed down the bankruptcy.
But it wasn't. It was more just a lifeline and less a saving grace.
Yes. Still a great comic event. I have read it, and it is amazing. It's good. It's better than the movie. If we're being honest.
Yeah. I've never read the comic, but I'll take your word for it.
Yeah. Any of you Marvel fans out there that haven't read it before, I do suggest it. It is good. You can get it at the library and stuff. You can get a collection of it at the library. Or, I guess, probably at your local comic shop, they might be selling the collection, or you might be able to just buy every individual issue.
Yeah. So, and then after Marvel saved themselves with Civil War, I assume they just sort of went on back to doing their normal thing, because they had the money and the stuff to do it.
Pretty much. I mean, they're still going strong today.
Yeah. And then they churned out movies and churned out movies and churned out movies, and
they're doing good. Yeah, after basically they made a bunch of movies because they wanted to make movies.
I mean, it worked.
And
Tons of people have watched Marvel movies.
yep, and now they're still climbing up. Actually, they've basically completely recovered from the '80s crash, from the bankruptcy, and they've actually achieved newer heights at this point.
So, how did the company in the industry react, I guess, when Stan Lee died? Like, what happened to Marvel? What happened to their popularity?
Well, their popularity didn't change.
Okay, I assumed.
People still loved Marvel, and they were sad that Stan Lee died, but they would still read the comics.
Yeah. Makes sense.
What happened to the company? Stan Lee was in charge of the company up until his death.
Yes.
And then after he died, Kevin Feige took over the entirety of Marvel.
Who?
Kevin Feige, he's the guy that runs Marvel Studios. Now he's in charge of everything Marvel.
Okay.
So,
Alright. So...
yeah. They did put, like, a mourning thing, like, rest in peace, Stan Lee. Whenever, like, a big Marvel name dies, they always put, like, a memorial thing in their comics. Stan Lee and Chadwick Boseman. Good.
Alright, so... And now we're basically at the present.
Yep.
And... so that's... basically the evolution of comics.
Yes. Marvel and DC were big frontrunner. DC hasn't changed a ton since the 80s.
And they've gone fine, I guess.
They're fine. They're still big.
They're fine.
Yeah, they're still
fine.
Marvel's biggest competitor.
Yeah. Alright. Well, alright, thank you for listening to Films, Comics, Books, and Games. I hope that you will come back for our next podcast, or listen to some of our others if you haven't. Go check out our YouTube channel, linked on our website. Yeah, thank you for listening. Hope you listen next time. And bye.
Bye.